Today I want to talk about linguistics for language revitalization. I'm exploring the intersections of these two fields, linguistics, language revitalization. This is something I've been developing for a little while, but this is the first time I am presenting it in this format. So I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments. Hopefully we'll have lots of time for that. And just by way of caveating a little bit, this is addressing just like a very small corner of a much broader discussion about language revitalization more broadly, language reclamation, decolonization in linguistics, in academics, things like that. So I'm just going to focus on a little small piece of it today, and just to know that there's a lot of context around some of these things, but I'm happy to elaborate on anything in the question period. So let us get going. My slides will advance, please. Okay. So first, I want to acknowledge all the folks that have helped contribute to this work so far, all my co-conspirators here at the University of Arizona and also back in Montana. I'd also like to thank in particular the members of the Saguaro group who are part of an ongoing project that I'm involved in, where we're working on creating a series of linguistics textbooks that address this topic, linguistics as it relates to language revitalization. Also in particular, I'd like to thank the faculty and staff at ALDI, the American Indian Languages Development Institute here at the University of Arizona. They in particular have helped to really shape this work. And I'll talk about those two projects here in a moment. But also I'd like to thank Dr. Denham for inviting me, and to all the linguistics faculty who might still be around that got me started on all of this. So thanks to everyone. Okay, so first I want to just preface this with a bit about me and my positionality by way of introduction, and just to sort of situate myself in relation to this work and this topic. Dr. Denham already outlined some of this, but I'm currently at the University of Arizona, and we are here on the traditional territories of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui people. And it is currently 82 degrees here, and it's hotter in my office. So if you can hear my fan going, I apologize, but hopefully it's not too disruptive. But anyway, so I'm down here and I'm working on my PhD. I just advanced to candidacy. I'm very happy and relieved about that. Just passed my orals. So it's been a busy couple of weeks, but my research focuses on language revitalization and, like Dr. Denham was saying, morphosyntax in North American languages, but particularly Algonquian languages, and particularly Blackfoot. And my training is pretty, I think, typical linguistics training. My upbringing is, on structures and patterns of languages, and then sort of having this revitalization experience interspersed throughout that. And this informs the way I approach this topic and the way I approach my work in general. So I did get my BA at Western Washington University, where I studied linguistics and Spanish. Then I went to Montana. This is where I started working on Blackfoot language and working with Blackfoot folks on their language. And I was also fortunate to be able to attend my first Co-Lang Institute on Collaborative Language Research. And that's where I really started to thinking about these ideas a little bit more seriously and in depth. And then I've continued that now that I'm here at Arizona. I am working on this field, language revitalization, and I've also been able to be involved in various institutes and projects that are specifically directed at this topic as well. So that's all informed where I'm at and where I hope to go. Okay, so it was in the course of all of that training that I started to develop the following questions. Where do linguistics and language revitalization intersect? What tools from linguistics are most useful for language revitalization? And how can linguistics better support these efforts? And in particular, these questions came into focus for me when I was teaching linguistics, intro to linguistics for Native American communities at ALDI last summer, I think now in 2022. And these questions actually came from my students. They were mostly either speakers or learners of their heritage language, and they were, told to take linguistics, and then they showed up and said, why are we here? What's the benefit? How can this help? So part of my job was to motivate the benefit of training in linguistics, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about here today. And then the other project that I already mentioned is the textbook project, where we're trying to sort of talk about these same topics and present tools from linguistics in a way that is grounded and useful and accessible to folks. And so I'll talk a little bit about that here too. Okay. Oh, the other thing I want to mention, there's a lot of literature out there about the interface between community member linguists or community members and linguists, usually this like insider outsider distinction. And I think a lot of that literature is super informative and useful, but there's not as much about the interface between linguistics and revitalization more broadly. So I'm hoping to sort of try to fill that gap here a little bit. So to start answering some of these questions, I want to just really briefly overview the field of language revitalization, sort of what's going on these days. Then we're going to look at the overlaps and the gaps between linguistics and language revitalization. Then the later half of the presentation is going to focus on some of the applications for linguistics that I think are particularly useful and relevant for this discussion. And then at the end, just some overview of what a linguistics for revitalization might look like going forward. Okay. So language revitalization, as I'm sure many of you know, is a multidisciplinary community-based effort to reverse language shift, often talked about in terms of language endangerment. And I'm not going to get into too much of this right now, just in the interest of time, but it's a very diverse field that incorporates lots of different tools and methodologies from lots of different fields and disciplines. But all of these things are brought together with the goal of re-embodying languages within communities, and often with the younger generations as a key focus. So creating new speakers is sort of the main goal that people talk about. They're always trying to look to train new speakers, to teach new teachers, to train new speakers, and to bring languages home into communities that way. But of course, there are other aspects like reclaiming culture, heritage, identity, health and well-being, using language in cultural activities like ceremonies, storytelling, and then, of course, broadening contexts of use, which we know is a good metric of language vitality, right? So if you're using the language at home, better to be able to use it also at school and also at work and also in the community and in your government and things like that. So these are some of the key areas of focus in most revitalization projects. But of course, there's no one size fits all model for language revitalization. Each community is going to have a different approach. In general, there is a trend happening in the field of language revitalization, and we've been shifting from a more linguistics-directed method where we have this triumvirate of documentation feeding into conservation, feeding into revitalization. I have the question mark there to indicate that that's not really explicated very much. It's just sort of like this hopeful outcome. And we're moving towards more community-based methods where we have more unified and holistic approaches that sort of tackle all three of these things at the same time, and also sort of switch up the direction of things, where revitalization begets documentation, and it doesn't have to start with one and then move on to the other. So that's where we're at in general. To make this a bit more concrete, I have included a list of things that might be included in a revitalization project. You will see that there's a lot of variety here. Some of these things might look like things that linguistics can help with, and some of them might not. I won't go through each of these in detail yet because we will in a little bit, but just to preview, if we look at what linguistics can really help directly support, our list might look a little bit more like this. So you'll see that there's a lot going on, and linguistics is certainly one component, but not the only component. So I'll talk about each of these that are actually in black text here in a bit, but first I want to address some of the parallels and some of the gaps between linguistics and language revitalization. Okay. So just zooming out and looking at this a bit historically, if we go back to the 19th century, that's when we start seeing language documentation happening in North America. This is where people started getting really interested in the indigenous languages here, particularly their differences from other languages that they were familiar with, and wanted to research these languages, document them, and generate new frameworks and new theories around that. So this is when the Boasian trilogy, the big three, were developed, and this was sort of the gold standard for language work at the time, and up until now, creation of grammars, dictionaries, and text collections is sort of like a good holistic snapshot of a language, and it dates back to that time and that tradition. And you'll notice that this actually predates the establishment of the field of linguistics, at least at the modern field of linguistics. So we had this documentation happening that fed into part of what fed into the establishment of our field. And this is also when we started seeing this split between descriptive linguistics, which is sort of what the Boasian linguists were doing, and theoretical linguistics, which came out of the data that they were collecting. It wasn't until the 1990s when we started seeing a broader recognition of language endangerment, which had been ramping up until that point. There was an important paper that came out in 1992 called Endangered Languages, which was sort of this big call to action to linguists to start paying attention to this and to start addressing it in their work. And this is also when we see language revitalization emerging as a subfield in its own right. And then about another decade after that, we had the emergence of community-based language research in terms of ethics, in terms of methods, and in terms of products of and outcomes of linguistic inquiry. So we started seeing this shift happening between research done, and again, the prepositions are important here, right? On communities, by and for linguists, shifting to linguistic research by, for, and with communities, and having community involvement and engagement, directing that process more and more. And if we look at these two fields today, you'll see there's lots of crossover and interaction. And I've just grabbed a couple of examples of where these things intersect and where we see them sort of working together. There's lots of different language institutes. Some have more of a teaching focus, some have more of a research focus, but these are places where linguists, community language workers, revitalizationists of all stripes come together to learn about language, learn about linguistics, learn about language teaching and things like that. So you'll see those happening all over the US and some in Canada. There are other ones as well, but just because these are the ones that I'm familiar with and that I focus on in my work, I've included them here. You will also find revitalization and linguistics showing up in university-based programs. There are specific four-year programs at the bachelor's level that teach you how to do revitalization, that teach you linguistics, but also the other pieces of revitalization too. And then we also see that at graduate programs, there's more of them at that level. And then at the end of the list, they're not really specifically language revitalization programs, but they are linguistics programs with this sort of an emphasis built in. So sort of at all levels of education, you see these crossovers happening. Lately, we've also been adding more options in terms of publishing for this type of work where it didn't normally have a home in some of the traditional linguistics journals that we had. We now see things like language documentation and conservation, living languages, language revitalization documentation, which is a new section in the language journal. And these are places where we see these topics discussed as well. And then lastly, we have some conferences that happen. I think most of these are annual conferences that specifically address this topic as well. So you can see that this is like a very alive and well intersection. There's lots of collaboration going on. There's lots of interdisciplinary projects going on at these intersections. But there are still gaps and differences in approaches and outcomes in the two fields, and I want to address those now. So this next section is entitled, Must There Be Two Solitudes? This is from a paper by Karen Rice in 2009. And she, in this paper, is addressing the differences between language activists and linguists and how they work together and how they can better work together. And what I would like to do is sort of apply that same logic to the fields more broadly, to the fields of linguistics and revitalization, and look at those through that lens. So this is a table here, which is very broad strokes and a bit reductive, but just to illustrate the point here, you'll see that there are lots of differences, right? The goals, the products, the methods, and the beneficiaries are all different. There are some places where they're the same, but in general, the goals of linguistics are to understand language by looking at languages to understand how they work, whereas revitalization, the goal is to increase language vitality. For linguistics, the products and outcomes that we usually produce are in the form of things like journal articles and books, scholarly research, whereas revitalization is a bit more concerned about creating new speakers. And there can be, crossover there too, right? In general, the methods of linguistics involve documentation and analysis, whereas the revitalization methods look a little bit more like teaching and learning, which can be informed by documentation analysis, but we'll talk about that later. And then the beneficiaries, traditionally especially, the beneficiaries of linguistics were linguists, right? And the field itself, whereas the beneficiaries of language revitalization is more are the people in the communities themselves. And we can see this sort of split exemplified in the way that we talk about language itself. So I've included two definitions of language here. The first one is a Chomsky definition from a few years ago, where he talks about language as a biological mechanism, saying that we study the mind and the mental representation of things like sounds, gestures, words, and sentences. This is a very linguistics-y definition of language. It's very technical. And just really to show the difference here, just to compare it, we have another definition from a language worker, a Tongva language worker, that talks about how language is this much broader thing, right? It's the basket that holds all of culture, and it's pretty much everything. So that's a pretty stark contrast there. We're working on the same thing, but we're really understanding it in very different ways. Others have talked about this and expanded on this a little bit more. The first quote that I've included here talks about how the process of linguistic inquiry can actually be harmful to language communities and to the speakers, where this process of categorizing and identifying and recording and analyzing can create what this author is calling linguistics cages. And that sort of like restricts the language a little bit in a way that feels very alien to speakers. The second quote talks about how linguistics, because of its legacy and its history, if it keeps doing what it has always done, may enforce its colonial legacy, and that when we do this, the results of our work is ineffective in language learning materials or creating language learning materials, and creates these sort of ill feelings between linguists and community members. So this is something that, even though progress has been made, our methodologies have changed over time, does persist and is still an issue in the minds of a lot of folks. It needs to be at least recognized and acknowledged when we start doing these types of collaborations. The approaches, however, are shifting. There have been some positive changes. This first one is talking about how we've sort of shifted from treating languages as objects of studies, as this like disembodied thing that you can observe and measure, to engaging in more holistic efforts to sustain them. And the second quote is talking about how we are increasingly listening to and incorporating the needs and the goals of communities into our work, and how that's producing more relevant, more grounded, and more effective results. So I hope to address that here in a moment. Okay. So what does this actually look like? What does this type of collaboration look like, and what are the fruitful and positive outcomes of these types of collaborations? The first ones I want to talk about are the direct applications, and then after that, the indirect applications. But before we get into any of that, I just want to disclaimer this. Your mileage will vary with all of this. So each language community needs to have its own approach, and certain things like the vitality of the language, the number of native speakers that are around, number of learners, and of course the needs and the goals of the communities are going to dictate which of these applications are more or less relevant and useful. So just knowing that, we'll move along. So the first thing I want to look at is documentation. This is sort of the most widely recognized contribution of linguistics to revitalization. It's something that linguistics does a pretty good job of, but there are things that we can do a little bit better. So the first thing I want to talk about is the process of creating new documentation. This is something that is particularly informed by our field linguistics training. Things that teach us how to, set up our mics properly and take good notes and process the data and get our interlinear glosses and keep track of all of our files and archive it and keep it safe for posterity and things like that all play into the creation of new documentation. But the other piece that I want to talk about a little bit more specifically is how this documentation is used and how it's implemented in revitalization programs. So there are two issues that we are working on addressing, I think, and I hope. There are two types of accessibility problems. So the first one is physical accessibility, like can you actually get and look at this material? If it's a recording, can you hear it? If it is a text collection, can you read it? Or is it maybe something that you need to pay for to access? Or is it something that lives in an archive in DC that you need to get to look at? So that's the first type of accessibility issue. The second one is about sort of intelligibility to a broad audience. As I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of things in linguistics that they're very specific. We have lots of jargon, we have lots of terminology. The way that we present data is codified in a particular way, and they're very specific to us. And if you don't have training in linguistics, it is very difficult to work with and to understand what's being represented on the page or what people are talking about in their analyses. And that, of course, has also changed over time, right? So when I look at a phonology paper from the 50s, and the theory was quite different at that point, even somebody with training in linguistics, with advanced training in linguistics, might not be able to access and understand that. So multiply that for people without training in linguistics, and then you'll sort of start to understand how difficult this can be. So one of the things that linguistics is really useful in is the work of transliterating these documentary materials, which we ourselves often created, into tools that are useful for revitalization. So this gets us into resource development. So I just want to show you a couple of examples of what this looks like. So this on the left is a photocopy of the original J.P. Harrington notes on the Mutsun language. This is a language which is a reawakening language of California. It's been asleep for about 100 years now, but there are people working with the language and learning the language today based on this documentary material. But when they first got a hold of the material, this is what it looked like. So you can see his handwriting's quite bad. It's very hard to read. The photocopy quality is sort of hit and miss. But fortunately, you can see on the right, somebody came along at one point and started typing this up on a typewriter, so at least it's a little bit easier to understand or at least read. So this is something that's been going on, since 1922, and it's gone through a couple of different iterations to get closer and closer to something that is a little bit useful actually to community members. So this is the starting point. And this is where we've ended up after quite a lot of processing. So what I'm showing you on the left is a text collection that I was involved in producing a few semesters ago, where we took all of the data out of all of this type of reproduction of the notes and put it into Flex. And we put it into this program where we were able to extract all of the different words. And from all of the different words, we were able to build this dictionary. So this is something on the left. This is accessible to anyone. It's been archived. It's publicly available on the internet. But you'll see that even with all of this processing that's happened to it, there's still quite a bit of terminology and formalism that you need to know and need to know how to understand to be able to access it. What we've done since then is on the right, we've started putting this data into a program called ILDA. This is the Indigenous Languages Digital Archive. So from the text collection, we have this dictionary. We've included all of the terms here on the right. And if you have this app, you can click on a word, you can go to the original page and see where he wrote it in his notes. But now you can also hear a heritage learner of the language pronounce this word and start practicing your pronunciation on your end too. So we've gone through this process of trying to transliterate those original field notes into something that is a little bit more accessible and a little bit easier to work with for folks. So that's one of those applications. I think one of the important applications for linguistics in community language work. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is resource development. So we have our big three that I talked about earlier. These are grammars, dictionaries, and text collections. And this is something where knowing about the structure of the language and the patterns that you see in the language is really going to be helpful when it comes to designing these types of resources that folks are going to use for language revitalization. particularly in cases like Mutsun where the language is sleeping and there are no first language speakers to consult. We really want our resources to be as accessible to folks as possible and as helpful as possible. So certain types of things are going to make certain choices for you as you're putting these types of things together. So the first example I have is for polysynthetic languages with lots of morphology in them, where you have really long words. You might organize your dictionary a little bit differently than you would, say, an English dictionary. So certain dictionaries are based on morphemes. Those are the head words rather than words, and you search based on that to get to the meaning that you're looking for. And you can see inflected forms sort of as a subcategory of that entry. Another example of this is flexible search tools. So if you have, for example, an online dictionary or online grammar, you want it to be able to be usable to folks, even if they can't remember how it's spelled, for example. So I have these 3 words in Blackfoot that I've included here. They're all the same word and they're all correct. But if you type any of them or anything close to any of them, you will get to the same head word and find what you're looking for. And so that's really helpful to build in. Another example of this is how data gets presented and how you might imagine different users interacting with your products there. So I have an example here from the COLRC. This is another project that's going on at the University of Arizona in collaboration with the Coeur d'Alene community. And they are working on an online database and dictionary where you have the option of showing or hiding different levels of information depending on what you're looking for. The idea behind this is that if you go and click on an entry and you see all of the technical categorization and the IPA and all of this other information, and you're just really looking for the definition, that can get a bit overwhelming and a bit cumbersome. So what they've done is instituted this show hide tool for the different fields. So you can just really customize your experience and get to the information you are actually looking for. So ideally, this is going to serve the needs of a wide variety of language workers and community members that way. So those are some considerations for specifically dictionaries and grammars. There are, of course, lots of other tools that we can generate based on language documentation and language analysis. One of them that I'm highlighting in the photos here is called Matilda. This is a pronunciation tool that was developed for the Blackfoot language. In this language, there is pitch accent. So the relative stress and intonation of a word is going to impact sometimes the meaning of the word, but very often just the pronunciation in terms of sounding native, like sounding like speakers. So this tool was developed by a Blackfoot teacher in collaboration with linguists and I think a musicologist. It was a very interesting interdisciplinary project. But this project created this tool that took language input from L1 speakers and ran it through Pratt. And then it spits out this pitch art sort of drawing of what the pitch contour looks like. And that's the thing that as a speaker, as a learner, you can look at and sort of compare your pronunciation to that and get closer and closer to what a native speaker sounds like when they're saying this word. So for example, if you say, I think this is the pitch art for like makoi, which is coyote. So you do need to go up in the middle or you're going to sound like you're saying it a little bit strangely. And this is something that was sort of directed by the learners and the teachers in tandem. The learners wanted to sound good. The teachers wanted to be able to explain the pattern. And this was a tool that they developed to be able to do that. So that's just one example of that. Another type of output for linguistics in language revitalization is orthography design. This is not something that all communities want or need, but if this is something that a community does want or need, there are lots of considerations that go into designing and implementing an orthography. And this is again determined by the structure of the language in many cases. So we want to be able to look at the language, understand the sound systems in the language, how words are generated, and be able to represent that accurately, effectively, and efficiently with our writing. So knowing a little bit about those structures is going to be super helpful for this type of work. There's lots of considerations that go into this. Orthography is one of those things that is extremely political, even though it maybe seems a little bit dry. But so some of the things that you might look into are what kind of writing system do you want? Does one of these types of systems fit your language better or not? Or is this just a aesthetic choice that you're making? There's also decision making around, do you want it to look like English or whatever the dominant language is, or do you want it to look quite different from that? Do you want to be using lots of diacritics or not? How is capitalization, punctuation going to work? Questions like that. And then, of course, you want to think about the functionality. If it's going to be Unicode compliant, is it going to show up right on a computer and a printer? Is it going to be able to work on your phone? Is it going to be easily learned? Are people learning this writing system coming from English writing, coming from Spanish writing, coming from a Cyrillic writing system? Is it going to be close or far away from that? So these are all different questions that we would ask ourselves. And, of course, in consultation with communities, try to develop these in a ways that are going to serve those needs in the best way possible. I've included a couple of examples here. The first one is the one on the left is a sort of star chart depiction of the Canadian Aboriginal syllabics, which are used to write a couple of different languages, including Blackfoot. The one on the right is the Cherokee syllabary, which I'm sure you all learned about at one point, but this is it on a keyboard. It's very cool to see it. I think this is an iPhone keyboard, so you can download this package and be able to type in text in Cherokee. And then down on the bottom, I have an example from the Mutsun language again. This is the pronunciation guide that was written for this particular letter. So what they chose to do is to choose something that's close to English, because the Mutsun language learners are all speakers and readers of English, so they wanted to keep it close by. But they've done something, instead of doing diacritics or creating new symbols for sounds that we don't have, they used capital letters. So this capital T is actually for the retroflex T. And there's this really nice sort of layperson's description of what that actually means and how you would produce it, which I really like. Okay, what else do we have? The next output that I want to talk about is word creation. This is something that, depending on your language situation, you may or may not need to be doing. But if you are doing this, you want to be able to make informed decisions about how you go about creating and bringing new words into the language. So in the case of a sleeping language again, or a language with few L1 speakers, you may want to be filling in some gaps that are not in the documentation. So for example, maybe there's a word that doesn't show up in the documentation, but of course there was one, and we're trying to recover that. And some knowledge of historical comparative linguistics can be really useful in this case. This is something that happened in the Wampanoag language community, where they were bringing back their language based on legacy documentation. And when there were gaps, they would look to sister languages and do comparative analysis to sort of infer what those forms would have been in Wampanoag and bring them back into the language that way. So that's a really cool case of that. Another case is neologisms. This is just building new words from the ground up. And this requires a lot of knowledge about naming conventions in the language, cultural practices around that, but also morphology itself. I've included over on the right my favorite neologism ever. This is for pizza in sock. It's I'm not going to try to pronounce it right now, it's quite long, but the gloss, or I guess the literal translation for this, is a great big tasty bread circle, which I just think is great. But that is sort of in line with the way that this language works. It's very descriptive in this way, and this was a choice, a conscious choice, to not just borrow in the word pizza and maybe change the phonology around a bit, but actually to create a new word based on the tools that are already in the language. So understanding that can help you do something like this. Another way that we can bring words into a language is through borrowing. And borrowing words into a language also requires linguistic knowledge, namely understanding things like sound inventories and syllable structure. This is an example that I included because it has just been burned into my memory from when I took phonology with Dr. Sandoval. We looked at Mele Kalikimaka and did some phonology to understand how we actually got to that from Merry Christmas based on the sound rules for Hawaiian. So that's also something that you can do, and that's very cool. Okay, so those are all of the direct applications for linguistics that I just wanted to highlight here because I think those are particularly useful. There are also some indirect applications. One of them that I want to talk about here is logistical support. And this is something that you might not think about, but it's actually super, super important and impactful. So one of the things that linguists and linguistics can bring to language revitalization is this type of support. Especially when we're based out of universities, we have access to all sorts of things that can support this work, including funding, labor, and structural support. So funding, we can go out for grants and get grant funding relatively easily. You have to apply and all of that, but there are grants that are specifically set up to fund academic research on languages that we have access to, and we can do that to funnel quite a bit of money into these revitalization programs. Another thing that we have access to is labor, not only our own labor as faculty members and students, but also in the form of research assistants. If you are at a program where that's part of your program, you might be assigned to work on a project for a semester, and then you're dedicating your time every week to that project, and the university or the grant is paying your salary during that time. So it's a really good way to get a lot of work done. Another thing that we have access to is structural support in the form of physical space, research labs, office spaces, access to equipment, computers, recording devices, things like that, access to libraries, access to journal subscriptions, and all of that information that can be gleaned from those places. So this is a really important area of support where linguistics can really redirect some of these resources towards revitalization projects. I've included just another example from the Mutson case, since we've been following it through so far. You can see that quite a lot of money was directed to this project, and that's just the grants. There's also labor, which the university and grants have paid for over time. I was one of those RAs during that semester, but there were actually two of us. The person who was the PI for this project happened to be the head of the department at the time. So she had access to 2 RAs for 20 hours per week. And our entire job for that semester was to get this tax collection processed and ready to go. And that's what we were able to accomplish in that time. So that was really cool. And then in terms of structural support, we were able to archive our project at the UA library and other libraries. We were able to have physical office spaces to work in, computers to use, and things like that. So this is an area that maybe is a little bit less about linguistics and more about academia, but it's still a really important point to make here. The other thing, which is another sort of incidental outcome, but is really critical, I think, is what linguistics can teach us about languages in general is really helpful for combating language ideologies that can be quite harmful and really cause things to slow down or stop or be hindered in terms of making progress in revitalization. So this is something that we talk about in Linguistics 101. One of the first things we learned is that all languages are equally complex systems that are rule governed. They're all able to express lots of different ideas in lots of different domains. And we sort of eschew this idea that there are modern and old or archaic languages, right? So we have all of these things that I think would be really good for the general public to know, and also for learners of their language to know, because it can be quite discouraging to bump up against these ideologies in your own life or just out in the world. So sort of being armed with the information that we're taught is a really helpful strategy to get across some of these hurdles that people encounter. And I've included this quote from a person who works here at the university, who works with language speakers a lot and has encountered this a lot. She says that one of the things, other than the tools, which I've sort of highlighted before, that we can get out of linguistics is this confirmation that their language is not something that is broken, bad, archaic, or unworthy. So that's another sort of output of linguistics that I wanted to highlight here. Okay. So those are just some of the applications, but I do want to acknowledge that there are, of course, limitations of linguistics in this field. Some of them we've been working towards overcoming, but others of them we still have not. The accessibility issue I sort of mentioned already. A lot of the outcomes of linguistic research, journal articles, dissertations and theses, things like that can get put behind a paywall or just be hard to find, and are not often given back to the communities where the language data that was used was generated. Again, this is something that people are getting better about, but this is still an issue. So the physical, literal access, and then the other type of access I was talking about with the specialized terminology, presentation of data terminology, and how we can make maybe that a little bit more accessible without requiring advanced training in linguistics for folks. I'll talk a little bit about recommendations in a moment. We do still have a gap in representation of community members, the people who speak these languages and are learning these languages in the research process and in the linguistics, the field of linguistics more broadly. So really briefly, just to sort of exemplify this, there were over 2,000 degrees, PhD degrees awarded in linguistics between 2004 and 2014, and only 8 of them were Native people. And this is something that is brought to light by the Natives for Linguistics Special Interest Group in the LSA. And one of their big goals is to increase the participation of these communities in terms of capacity building and training them to do this work. So they highlight that. The reason that this representation and engagement matters is that when we don't have these people involved at all levels of the process, we can get resources that do not necessarily reflect the goals, needs, and ways of knowing of communities, and we can end up reinforcing those harmful colonial ideologies that I was talking about earlier. So we want to not do that. And then the last piece I want to talk about is the way that we do and produce research. We don't necessarily build collaboration and reciprocity into our research methods, though we are trying to, and people are trying to. But sort of the basis of linguistic work still is to go to communities, access and record their knowledge, analyze it, and present that data and that analysis in a format that works for linguists, but maybe not necessarily for communities. So that's something that needs to be addressed. The other thing that needs to be addressed is that revitalization work is still viewed a lot of the time as community service and not necessarily as scholarship. And this starts to matter when you're going up for tenure and things like that. Whether the work you're doing counts and is valid, or whether you were supposed to be doing more rigorous scholarly work instead. So that's sort of a hurdle. And then the last bit is that linguistics is not great at contextualizing language in terms of the culture and the community that it comes from. And this is something, again, that we're learning more from other fields as we engage with more interdisciplinary work and as we engage with more community scholarship. But as one language worker said, you can't revitalize a language without socializing learners both in the culture and the language. So this is another really important gap that linguistics can't quite fill yet. Okay, so just in the last few minutes here, what do we do from here? I've already hit a lot of these points, but just to reiterate, a linguistics for language revitalization is one that acknowledges and reflects on its roots, on its strengths and its limitations. It's going to identify and hone its practical applications. Those are the ones that I highlighted. I hope to do a little bit of that here. And then, understanding what the limitations are and seeing where we can address them and where we just need to step back is another step. Revitalization needs to be built in at the ground level. It needs to be a part of your project from the beginning, not just an outcome that you sort of tack on at the end. Another thing we need to do is work on how we can democratize the knowledge that we generate, not only by inviting community direction and engagement in our products, but also by sort of changing the way that we present our research and communicate it to the broader public. And then the last bit is that not only do we do this work, but we advocate for this work and we recognize it as valued and valuable and necessary, and incorporate that into the ways that we move through the field in terms of the way we design curriculum, the way we publish our papers, what counts for tenure, what is a priority for grant funding, and things like that. So these are just a couple of suggestions. I'm really curious to hear what everybody has to say, how they might approach this if they were doing this type of work. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. When I first taught this class, the Aldi class called Linguistics for Native American Communities, I sort of opened up with these questions and tried to run the class in a way that allowed us to continually explore them and ask them to each other over and over again throughout the class. And these classes are like 5-week condensed intensive summer sessions. So we were talking together quite a lot about this. We were meeting like 3 hours a day, going back and forth. So one of the things that we did in that class was to have the final project be basically exemplifying what the takeaways were. What were the things that you found the most useful and that you wanted to take home with you and use in your language work? And a lot of the students ended up producing sort of a little mini sketch grammar, and they were highlighting the different pieces that they found particularly useful. So some students really wanted to focus on the pronunciation and the teaching of pronunciation side. And so their projects looked a little bit more like that. Other students were really focused on orthography development. So they talked a lot about that piece. Others were talking about, word creation and things like that. So each student sort of had a different take on what they thought would be the most useful, given what they were working on at home and what they were working on in their communities. So that's sort of where I developed the initial, the different outcomes that I highlighted. So that's one piece of it. We're also in the process of doing this textbook project. And one of the ways that we're trying to make sure that we're actually responding to the needs of communities and the needs of language revitalization on the ground is to send the chapters out for review and revision to different language communities, and to see if it's like speaking to them, if it's accessible to them, and if it's addressing the goals that they have in mind for their own languages. So those are two ways that we're trying to make sure that this is a collaborative process as we're going through it. But yeah, I haven't taught that initial class since then. I'm not teaching it this summer. So I would be curious to run it again and sort of be able to present these ideas at the beginning rather than sort of arrive at them at the end of the class, and to see if that would be, more helpful for folks to sort of start there and then work backwards. Yeah, so primarily, like I was saying, I think it really started when I was working with speakers in Montana and sort of starting to hear about how the things that I had come up learning maybe weren't necessarily meshing with their understanding of language and their understanding of what they wanted to get out of this type of training that we're engaged in, and sort of hearing about, actually it's not all good all the time, and here are the issues, and just learning about that side of it was really important for me. I actually started on that path, though, I think a little bit earlier at Western. I worked on a project with Dr. Lobeck. I don't know if you remember, a really long time ago. We were working on linguistic diversity at the university, and sort of trying to, understand the situation and also support as much of it as we could through recognition. And that was sort of my first foray into this. That plus working on Swahili in your syntax class revealed that there was a lot more going on than I initially understood. And that's what led me to working on Blackfoot, actually, was not the revitalization piece, but the polysynthesis piece. So that was sort of an interesting trajectory. I think a lot of people get into this coming from a revitalization place more earlier on, I guess, than me. I kind of came through the theory side and then started learning about the revitalization piece as I went. But yeah, just trying to hear from scholars who are doing sort of working at these intersections and working with those folks and getting more and more exposure as I go. There's always stuff that pops up. So I've just been trying to volunteer myself whenever I can. And that's how I ended up at the grad programs that I pursued. Was I knew that was a focus for them, and that was something that I wanted to pursue as well. So at those places, it's sort of everywhere. It's hard to avoid. So I've been learning just as I go. One thing that I always hear is that if you learn how to work with one Indigenous community, you know how to work with one Indigenous community. So it's always hard to generalize, but I think just sort of being aware, surveying the landscape that you're in, seeing, you know, if anybody is already working in those areas, and just getting in contact with those people would maybe be the first steps I would take. But yeah, case by case. So my dissertation work as it stands, and I'm working on my prospectus now, so we'll see, but it's basically focusing on nominal flexion in Blackfoot and in other Algonquian languages. There's a lot of syncretisms in the nominal paradigms, and different configurations of how the features get expressed in the different languages, and that's what I'm interested in. We are days, at least at my department, to do it like a 3-article style dissertation. So you know, maybe there's 3 large pieces that end up getting split into different chapters, but then at the end of your dissertation, rather than publishing it as like a book, you publish 3 different articles, and those can get sent off to publishers more quickly, and then they go on your CV more quickly. So there's some strategy to that. So my approach was to write like a chapter on the description, a chapter on the theory, and then a chapter or a article on the revitalization piece, and sort of try to weave those together throughout the whole thing. And I think that I don't think that there is any theoretical inquiry that's going to be completely useless for communities or for revitalization, but I think sometimes it can get a little bit esoteric and less directly relevant for folks. But I think the process of distilling the information and thinking through how it might actually be used is a really important step that I'm currently engaging in, and that others can do. So one of the things that I'm looking at is these syncretisms, like I was saying, where you've got an overlap of one form that expresses multiple different meanings, and how that comes about. The theory, I'm using distributed morphology to account for this, but you don't need to know distributed morphology to know that like there are certain overlaps and certain patterns that arise. I know in Algonquian languages, people are very fond of teaching with paradigms. So they'll draw up the paradigm, all the suffixes on the board. And so I think my work, you know, insofar as it relates to understanding the distribution of forms within those paradigms, can inform that. There's also a bit that I do about, you know, theorizing the organization of features within the language. And I'm really curious to compare that to how speakers organize these features or think about these different meanings in their language, and if that can influence the theory itself or influence the way that I talk about it. So I think there's a bit of a dialogue back and forth that you can do between the theoretical side and the practical side. But again, that would always have to be community directed. I have ideas for maybe how I think it might be useful, but you know, it remains to be seen if it's actually helpful. So yeah, I think that one's a little bit tough. One thing that I have been seeing a lot, I think, is that people will write a theoretical paper, and then at the end they'll say in the implications section, like, and revitalization. And that's not sufficient. So I think we have to, you know, start there, but then sort of follow that through and see where that actually comes out. And if it's not directly useful, maybe don't sell it as being directly useful. But again, case by case, right? So you can represent lots of different language structures with lots of different writing systems, right? A lot of people make the choice, if they do want a writing system, to have it look similar to whatever language people are coming from, so that there's not this additional hurdle of learning an entirely new writing system that looks very unfamiliar while you're also trying to learn the language. But there's another camp that does not want their language to look like a colonial language like English, and they go a completely opposite way in terms of aesthetics and in terms of the systems too. So that's where you might find things like the Cherokee syllabary, which is sort of Latinate, I guess, if you look at it, but even less so, I guess, the Cree syllabary looks nothing like English. And my understanding is that was like a very intentional decision for it to not look like the language of the colonizers, right? And to look distinctive and to feel more representative of this sort of distinct language and linguistic identity. But yeah, I think it just really depends on what the goal is, right? Another big issue with orthography design is that when you write something down, you have to go through this process of standardization that can be a bit difficult. So not only are you trying to maybe make the language be written when it hadn't been before, now it's starting to look like English if you're using the Latin alphabet, or Spanish, if you're in South America. And now also you have restricted variation in a way. So that can be quite a jarring process for speakers. So I don't know, I don't have an answer, I guess, but there's just a lot of considerations, and there's lots of stories about people, having these days-long meetings and conferences to try to hammer out what the orthography is going to look like. And there's a lot of bad feelings that can be generated in those types of meetings. But there are other stories where people are like, yes, let's just write it. Doesn't matter. We'll just do whatever. But you will notice that nobody is using like the IPA to write their language every day. So that's one thing that seems to be a bit universal, is that system is too cumbersome. So people look for other alternatives.
And I have maybe just one comment about the your list of things that still need to be done at the end, and the recognition of such work by whoever's doing it, but if they're in an academic setting for tenure and promotion, grants, etc. And that here's one place where the Linguistic Society of America, the professional organization, and individual universities can make a big difference in how this work is accepted and recognized as scholarship. And the LSA had a statement on the merit of language documentation and revitalization work that then universities can use to help support that within their own departments, if the people in the department are on board, which is often an issue. But I think there are some things we as linguists, a community of linguists, can do to help reinforce and believe that it is vital work worthy of scholarly recognition.
Yeah, I actually think we did that here at Arizona after that statement came out. We were in the process of doing our tenure review guidelines, I guess. And they made a provision that if you're doing work that is not publishable because the community doesn't want it to be published, or for whatever reason it can't be published because it's maybe not something that journals want to publish, that still counts in your tenure packet. And when you do that type of work, the peer reviewers need to include stakeholders in that language community. So that brings in other types of expertise into the review process to be considered as well, and on equal ground. And I think that was a direct outcome of that LSA statement. So it is really cool to kind of see the shift happening in real time.